Right, welcome to hello. It's just just come on. Welcome to Real Tarts. But this bit of it is about Gone, which is a book I wrote for my kids. Now, the interesting thing is about this. It's interesting. You do need to write these things down for your kids because I was going through stuff today and I thought there are actually some things just not sure about in terms of when I did them. There's also a chapter essentially that's not in the book. The reasons for that will become fairly plain as time goes on if you follow this story, I think. But anyway, first of all, let me introduce myself to anybody who doesn't know. Tony Bosworth. I'm the editor of the West Wyalong Advocate at the moment in the Riverina, New South Wales. Yes, what am I doing here? You may wonder. All right, let me tell you the story. So I'm going to cover a period which I think was probably around age 11 to 13. It all tends to blur one into another. I think, as I've said yesterday, if you're following it, I always think at this stage of my life, I was kind of 11, But anyway, I must have been 11 to 13. Anyway, let me just sort of tell you a few things about that and where we went. And this is a forgotten chapter, really. Okay. So anyway, so we were living in Leicestershire. When we originally moved from the north of England, I was born in Middlesbrough. And when I was 1 year old, we moved. And we moved to Leicestershire, nearer the family. They were all in that area, like the grandparents, for example. And we lived in a village called Kibworth Beecham, which is it's next door to a village called Kibworth Harcourt. I mentioned that a bit about that before and about the church there. I'll go on to that in a little minute or two. But yeah, by the time I was about 11, this will be the case. By the time I was about 11, I was a choir boy. And I didn't mind that at all. I thought it was quite good. I really enjoyed it. I never had any problem with the vicar, who was Reverend Ireland at that time. And I then became an altar boy and did that. So often I was getting up there just around about dawn time, actually cycling up there on my bike and helping the vicar with his morning service. There was never anybody there. Never. We just kind of went through the service. He was a good bloke. Yeah, no problems there. And I was in the choir there, right? So there was that. Also, I'd started smoking. It's about age 11. Players number 6, usually. I can't tell you what price they were. They were really cheap at the time. They were cheap, even for a kid who didn't have any money. And you could buy them in packets of 10. And I think at one stage you could buy them in packets of 5. Anyway, it was a filter cigarette. So I started smoking. And yeah, when I couldn't, this is true. This is ridiculous. How I'm still standing, I don't know. When I didn't have any money for the players number 6, what I would do is I would make cigarettes out of tea leaves, right? I'll get loose tea and I'd put it, it's even worse than this. It's even worse than you think. I would get tea leaves and I would put them in rolled up newspaper. Can you imagine this? And then I'd go out and I'd take the dog for a walk. I'll tell you about him later. He actually does have a chapter all to himself. And I would take the dog out for a walk in the evenings and I would smoke this ridiculous cigarette. You just wouldn't do it. Can you imagine the chemicals that were going in my lungs back then? Oh my God, it's unbelievable, isn't it, really? Also, I had this mate. I was trying to remember his name. I couldn't remember his name. But anyway, his mother worked at an old people's home in a village not far from Kibworth called Great Glen. Obviously, it's still there. And anyway, he liked to smoke. We all like to smoke, quite frankly. Most of us are smokers in those days. But what he did was he got me a couple of lighters, right? And it's dreadful, really. One of the lighters, and I was probably about 12 by this time. Let's say I was 12. Things were moving on, right? Almost a teenager. And one of the lighters he got me was a DuPont solid gold, right? Didn't think about it at the time. The only thing about it was the most beautiful, beautiful lighter. But it weighed down my trousers on one side, or my shorts if I was wearing those, right? And it was really annoying, actually. But you look up the price of DuPont lighters these days, it's ridiculous because, of course, they're exceptionally good. There was me, 11 or 12-year-old kid, lighting his players number 6 or his tea leaf cigarette with a DuPont solid gold lighter. Anyway, sad thing is this. What I thought years and years later, of course, I figured it out. His mother worked at an old people's home and she was obviously stealing these things, right? Because he actually gave me 2 or 3 lighters. I remember this. his mum was stealing them off old people or people who were dying. Dreadful, dreadful. That's a long time ago. The other thing about him was he had access to alcohol. So what he used to do is he'd bring vodka into school in a little bottle, and before assembly, we'd chug a bit, right? It was my first introduction to alcohol. I reckon I was about 12. Actually, it's not quite, maybe it wasn't my first introduction. I remember my dad showing me how to make ginger beer, and I certainly made some of that. So that might even have been before then. And that was pretty alcoholic, let me tell you. It's ridiculous, really, when you think about it, But I suppose if you go back in time, like Henry VIII's reign or something, kids were drinking beer for lunch. Sorry, they were drinking beer for breakfast. So maybe it's not so unusual. But anyway, there you go. So that was that. Now, weekends, we always used to go out for a drive on a Sunday, I think, usually, always. And what my dad would do sometimes is, well, basically, we'd go for a drive. We'd stop somewhere. If we saw berries, blackberries or whatever on the hedges, or a lot of hedgerows then probably don't even exist anymore, we'd pick them. And he also made homemade wine. So elderflower champagne. It's bloody good. Fair dues. He made that from elderflowers, and there were lots of those around at the time. And also, the best thing he made, which I never really drank much of, especially when I was younger, was sloe gin, making gin out of sloe berries, right? And in those days, you could just go and pick them. They're on the roadside pretty much. And yeah, we'd do that. Sometimes he'd disappear for a little while, right? Which I didn't think about until years later. We lived near RAF Bruntingthorpe. That was a RAF station. It had barely been used by them even during the Second World War, but it had been taken over by the Americans. When we lived there, closed in the mid-60s. So it's possible, I think it is possible they were still flying planes there at that time. Anyway, I'm just mentioning that. It'll all come together. It'll all come together in the end. Okay. Now, one interesting thing is, so my grandfather, Percy, he lived with my grandmother in Lorna. They lived in Rugby, which wasn't that far away, and had a decent house there. It has a nice house and had plenty of land. When I was a kid, I used to go there. It had an orchard. Always seemed massive to me. It probably wasn't. And he kept pigs as well. So I always used to go and sort of like talk to the pigs, and I never did anything bad. But what I used to do is, and if I had any mates come with me, which happens sometimes, I would shoot arrows from a homemade bow at his apples. Oh my God, I would shoot so many apples down. I was actually quite good at it. One thing I'm good at is aim. I just say that again. We're going to come back to that a little bit, but that's what I used to do. Anyway, I love to go into that house. It's brilliant. Really brilliant. But he used to have afternoon naps, right? I found that really annoying, because we had to be quiet and we couldn't do anything and all of that. So I was really annoyed about it when I was a kid. Nowadays, I think, it makes a lot of sense having a nap, it really does. Anyway, here's the thing. I had to learn French. I was a little kid. I reckon this one I would have been about 11 or 12 tops, maybe 10 even, right? And I had to learn, je suis Tony, and, I'm happy to meet you and all this sort of thing. I had to learn it in French. And I thought it was really weird at the time, but it was because he was being visited by this man, right, from France. Now, my granddad, he worked at Rugby radio station, which you can still see if you drive up the M1 in Britain, right, near Rugby. And what is it? It's a radio station. It sends signals out. It helps communications, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot more than that, let me tell you. So when I was a kid, I went there once with the granddad, and he was showing me around, and all of this. And we met this guy who was sitting there. He was sitting there at a I was going to say a computer. It wouldn't have been a computer. It didn't exist then, but it was some kind of console or something like that. And he had headphones on. And my granddad said to me, "Hey, listen, can he have a listen? It's my grandson. Can he have a listen to what's going on there?" Guy goes, yeah, of course. Gives me the headphones, right? It's garble, 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 right? And anyway, I took the headphones off after a short while, and then I repeated what had been said. And they both looked at me like, what's going on here, right? And I repeated it. And I said, what was that, And the bloke goes, Well, that was a Russian submarine captain speaking to his base at the bottom of the Barents Sea. I remember that. I remember it really clearly. So they basically, it's a spy station. Oops, shouldn't have said that. Maybe it isn't anymore, but that's partly definitely what it was, a communication station. They were tracking like Russian submarines. Thing was, I'd managed to repeat all that was said really easily in Russian. I didn't speak Russian, obviously, but my dad did. He was fluent in Russian, right? Now, he'd spent a short period of time in the intelligence corps when he was doing national service. It was kind of, I think it would have been at the end of the national service period. That's what he did. And he learned Russian. And he said to me at one stage, I said, why did you learn Russian? He said, oh, because at one stage they were going to parachute us into Russia as spies, you know. Good Lord. Anyway, so that was that. Anyway, why did I have to learn French? This guy was coming over to meet my granddad. And he used to be, my dad told me about this at the time when I was a kid. He used to be a resistance leader. He was in the French resistance during World War II. You got to bear in mind, when I was born, the war had only finished about 13 or 14 years earlier, right? Anyway, this bloke was coming over. For years and years, I wondered why, how my granddad knew him. Anyway, it turned out years later, my dad told me that he'd been his contact, right? He had talked to him in France, and obviously mainly Morse code, I suppose, but he had talked to him as well on the radio when he was there in France during World War II. So that's an interesting thing, right? Anyway, the smoking, I kept doing it. I was always smoking cigarettes. And what we used to do when we used to go for a drive, then often I'd go off. I would always have some cigarettes. I do know where I got the money from. So I used to do a meat round. I was a meat round person. I'd use my bike, work for a butcher. I'd deliver meat in the mornings to people who'd ordered it, right? Sometimes they're quite a way out in these little villages in Leicestershire, Saddington, Fleckney, all these places, right? So I had some money. I was pretty sensible with money. What would I spend it on, really, you know? And so, yeah, I used to buy cigarettes, and I'd buy different things. I had Woodbines for a while. I used to smoke that. Senior service. These are cigarettes without filters, right? It's ludicrous. Anyway, we'd go out for the weekend trip, and I'd go off in the woods because there's always some woods around. I'd have a Woodbine, right? You know, right? My sister said to me, the older sister, she said to me many years later, she said, I grew up thinking that you were the smell of the countryside. And it was the smell of cigarettes. She thought if you went in the countryside and walked off, because she never did it, right, when she was that age, she thought that's the smell you came back with. It's a countryside. It smelled like that. It's actually Woodbines. That's ridiculous, isn't it? Oh, I don't know. Now, my dad, he used to smoke a pipe, and then he got ill. He had a cyst, and it had to be removed. It wasn't cancerous or anything, but they said to him, you got to stop smoking. So he tried to stop smoking. And he started smoking cigars for a while. And then he stopped completely, right? But my grandmother, my mum's mum, she still kept sending him cigars every Christmas, right? And he kept telling her, I don't smoke anymore. But she kept sending them mannequins, they were, right? Packets of mannequins, a couple of packets every year, every Christmas. Anyway, I discovered them in the wardrobe, and I basically just worked my way through them, right? It's ridiculous, right? Smoking cigars. How I must have looked, you know, probably as 12 or 13 at that stage. The other thing I should mention is, just as an aside almost, is so I knew this girl called Zosia. All right, she was Polish. Her mother was Polish. Her father was English, right? And she was adopted. And she was actually a year, maybe 2 years older than I was. And the reason, and she was in my class at school, and she had the best legs ever. I noticed that straight away, which I tend to do, even when I was a young man. And yeah, so anyway, I got friendly with her, right? I was never anything else much going on, unfortunately, but I got friendly with her, and it ended up that on the way to school, I'd go to her house, and then we walked to school together. But meanwhile, and her parents had both gone to work at this stage, right? So this would have been when I was 11, definitely. And so she'd let me in, and she'd just be wearing a bra and knickers. right? She wouldn't be wearing anything else, and she'd spend ages getting ready. I don't think she was really putting on makeup. I don't know what she was doing. She spent a long time doing that. This went on for a long time. I go there every day and basically look at her backside, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, that's obviously that is relevant to what I'm telling you as well. Anyway, there you go. The other thing I was doing at the time when I was 11 was babysitting. And I was doing it for a few people, and I was doing it for a couple over the road, lived over the road. Now, their house, they had a big garden. They were opposite our house, right? Road in between. Their garden stretched right down to the golf course. So behind them, there was just a golf course, right? And I think it's still the case now. I don't think it's been, that golf course is still there. I don't think it's been sold or anything like that. And they had a big block. I reckon, again, I was young. It may not have been as big as I thought, but I don't know. I reckon it was fairly sizable. Anyway, I'm just checking all these things in because they're all going to come back and make sense. So I used to go over there, look after the two little kids. Sometimes this couple, they'd be late back, and so I'd sleep over there, even though, the house is only over the road. That was all right. Okay. Now, through church, kind of, I went to the Royal School of Church Music for a course at Matlock in Derbyshire, because I was in the choir and my singing was pretty decent, right? And I got this opportunity to go. Now, I know it didn't cost anything. I don't know what it was, scholarship or something. Anyway, so that came up, and I was taken down there. And again, I reckon, I would have been 11. Honestly, my voice probably broke when I was about 12. I was always a bit of an early developer in some respects, So I was taken down there by the organ player, whatever you call him, right? I can't remember his name, but he had a Sunbeam Lotus, right, which is super fast, and he took me down there. And in some ways, it was the worst thing because initially I was so homesick. It was unbelievable. And get this, so where they had it, right, was in a private school. It was closed for the summer holidays, and it was in a private school. And so, we were bunking down there, and the beds are already there. In the bedside cabinet next to mine, right, somebody had written in pencil or something, inside the drawer, "Please don't be homesick." Oh my God, it was the worst thing. I bloody hated it, right? I hated it. Anyway, that's until I met Jerome. Now, as you know, I have this propensity to say, and then I met Jerome, and that's actually his name, right? We'll call him Jerome. That is actually his name. In this instance, his name is not Jerome, okay? But I'm telling you, that's what his name is, okay? And that'll make sense. What happened was, so I'm at the school, I'm doing the singing thing, and they're teaching me all about that and all that part of the day. Right, we're there for about a week, I think it must have been. On the third day, no, it would have been on the second day, a few of us, that was the other thing about it. So kids there were from all ages, right? There were kids my age. I was probably the youngest. And then there were older kids as well. Much, much older kids. Possibly young adults, I think. Anyway, on the second day, some of us were siphoned off to go somewhere else. And we got on this little bus, and off we went to a very short trek to this old stately house, right? And when I got off the bus, I saw this kid who was already sitting there, and he was sitting on a rock, right, in the garden, and he was smoking. And I thought, oh, right, okay. Anyway, this was Jerome. And as I walked past, he said he's from Alabama, right? I still keep in touch, of course I do, with him now. And he goes, "Yeah, how you doing?" I couldn't even understand him, I said, yeah, I'm fine. He said, "You want a lucky?" I didn't know what he was talking about. I said, well, sorry, what do you mean? "You want a lucky?" He was asking me if I want a Lucky Strike, right? American cigarette. I said, and he offered me one. I said, "Oh, maybe later." "Yeah, okay." Anyway, so we go in, and then they're teaching us stuff. First of all, the bloke there, I can go into it a bit more if I have to. The bloke there starts speaking Russian. And then he looks at me and he says, Can you repeat that for me? He was American as well, strangely enough. And I could repeat it perfectly. Okay. Anyway, here's what we did. So every afternoon for about a week, we'd go down there and we'd be learning things, right? We'd be learning. I think they were, well, I know what they were doing. They were assessing us, right? And see what skills we had, right? Now, years later, right? Because I'll have to jump back to this, obviously. Years later, Jerome, he was telling me, right, that he was up for going in the SEALs, the American SEALs, right? And what they did there as part of the training, right? They set him up, they let him loose in some forested area. This was in Alabama, right? So he lived there all his life. He'd grown up there. His grandfather was part Cherokee, right? So anyway, I think that has a lot to do with it. So what they do is they set him off and they go, we are now going to hunt for you. We are going to find you, right? You've got to evade us. And this thing was go on for 2 days or something, right? Jerome was like, yeah, I was enjoying it out there because he used to do it already, right? When he was a kid, that's what he used to do, you know? He'd just go out in the woods for days, you know? Reason he was smoking Luckies was he used to smoke at school, right? I said, how did that happen? He said, well, I won't do the accent again at the moment. He said, well, I just had my granddad had to write a letter to the school to tell him that I could smoke. And then he could smoke it. Right. This would be in the, I don't know what it would be, late 60s, maybe early 70s. Yeah, it'd have to be early 70s, right? 71, 72. Anyway, so what he was out there for 2 or 3 days. They captured, as it were, all the other guys who were out there, right? They captured them easily within the 2 days. Jerome, he's staying out there, right? In the end, they had to send a helicopter over with a loudspeaker saying, it's over now, Jerome, you can come on out. And I said, well, what did you do? He said, oh, I just stayed out there another day, you know. So anyway, he qualified and became a Navy SEAL. And very many funny things about this, because he was telling me one day, because I never went through that sort of thing, but he was telling me one day that he'd been taught how to swim with his hands and his legs tied together. I'm not sure they were all tied completely together, the four of them. But anyway, his hands were tied, his legs were tied. And he said he learned how to swim. And I said, without thinking, I said, well, that'd be useful. And then I thought, but why? Why would that be useful? Why would that be useful? If you're already tied up like that, the main thing is to get out of it, isn't it? Not to swim away. But anyway, there you go. Yeah, so that was interesting. And the other thing we learned to do a little bit of was shooting, right? Mainly with rifles, little 2.2 rifles, you know. Anyway, after the course, I came back. I was glad to be back home, really glad to be back home. My singing was marginally improved, I think. And I was still doing the babysitting and all that. Anyway, the people over there doing who I babysat for, they had a gun. I don't know why, really. They had a 2.2, right? So I found it. And when the kids were asleep, their kids were little. They go to sleep early. You'd never hear from them again. Sometimes I get the gun, load it up, go out in the garden, do a bit of shooting. You know, it's 2.2. It wasn't terribly loud. But yeah, I'd do that, and I could fire it across a golf course as well, because there's nobody there that time of night, right? It'd get a bit dark. So that was all good practice. Anyway, there we are. So that's that. And what I'm gonna do next, I know more questions and answers. Let me tell you one thing though. I've mentioned it elsewhere on here, but I'll just tell you. I got in touch with a girl that I used to know when I was 16. We'll come on to that, right? And I got in touch with her not that long ago, actually. And I said, look, how's it going? Blah, blah, blah. She said, oh, what have you been doing? I was telling her. And she said, oh, that's interesting. She said, because we always thought that you'd either be a politician or a spy. And I said, I've never been a politician. I kind of left it at that. Anyway, look, that's it for me this evening. I've got a bit of a heavy day tomorrow. And also I'm driving up country on Thursday, actually, to go and see some people about another job. Can you believe? There's always some reason for that. But anyway, let's go into that later. And look, I hope you've enjoyed this one. It's not fantastically amusing, I suppose, but I'm just trying to tell a story. My kids need to know these things, I suppose, ultimately, don't they? Anyway, there you go. And yeah, look, let's talk again tomorrow. You take care out there, right? Have a good evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are. And if I can find the mouse cursor, I'll just end this, and we'll all be feeling a lot better for ourselves. Here we go. All right.